On the night of September 11th, 1899, a 23-year-old student named Alice Knott sat in her bedroom in the Washington, D.C. boarding house where she lived, doing what she did every single night, which was to study. So Alice rarely left her room. She'd spent the last few months preparing to take this really important civil service exam, which she had to pass if she wanted to land the stable government job that she desperately wanted. But studying was not the only reason that Alice seemingly never went out. Alice was also sort of naturally a recluse, in part because she had a lot of health issues, like a weak heart and poor circulation, and she just generally got sick a lot. So being out in the world was really tiring for her and also sort of scary. And it was just easier and safer to stay inside. Now, it was getting late in the night, and there was some cold air coming in through her open bedroom window, and it was actually unusually cold outside tonight. And since she got sick pretty easily, she didn't want to risk this draft coming in giving her a cold or something. So she set her work down for a moment, and she went up to close the window. And then on her way back to her desk, she smiled at the other very important reason that she spent so much time in her room: her beloved pet parrot, Polly. And Polly was sitting on his typical perch, one of the room's light fixtures, and as he saw Alice approaching, he got really excited and began squawking really loudly. Now, Alice knew that basically any minute now, she was very likely going to hear a loud knock at her door about the loud noise, because most of the people who lived in this boarding house with her hated Polly. And Polly, admittedly, was kind of a mean bird. Not only was he really loud, but he bit people and made really threatening noises and had some bad disruptive habits that pretty much drove everybody who lived in the building crazy. Like right now, Polly, in addition to squawking really loudly, was also pecking the metal frame of the light fixture that it was on, which not only made additional noise, but it also damaged the light fixture. Which, to most people in the building, they didn't care so much about the light fixture, but the landlord did. And so it was just this general consensus that Polly is sort of nasty and loud and also damages stuff. So nobody liked Polly, and they really told Alice that she needed to get rid of Polly, and soon, because he is a real problem. But Alice would not get rid of Polly. She loved Polly, and Polly loved Alice. He wasn't mean to Alice. He followed her around everywhere and was very sweet to her. And so Alice she felt very attached to this bird. In fact, in many ways, she viewed Polly as being sort of like her only family. The only reason she was in this boarding house to begin with is because her brother and both her parents had passed away. And so a lot of time, it was just Alice and Polly in this room together. And so it was just a very important relationship. It was like the only relationship that Alice really had. And so Alice just walked over to Polly, who was still squawking loudly and pecking at this light fixture, and she just told him to stop what he was doing. And he listened. He went completely quiet, and, she pet him for a second, and then a moment later, she was back at her desk, back to studying, and for the next few hours, that's what she did, until her eyes got too tired to stay open, and she went to bed. Hours later, in the middle of the night, Alice suddenly stirred awake, and she sat up in her bed. And she had no idea what caused her to wake up. But what she did know is something just felt wrong. Her chest felt incredibly tight, and she actually felt kind of dizzy. And so she got out of bed, and she stumbled her way over to the door to get help. But she didn't get there. After taking only a few steps, her legs suddenly gave out from under her, and she fell to the ground. The next day, just before 1 p.m., the landlord of the boarding house bustled around the kitchen, putting some lunch on the table. And then when he was done and all the food was laid out for his guests, he called out to the house to let everybody know that lunch was ready and to come on down. And a few moments later, all the guests appeared at the table, except for Alice. Now, the landlord immediately noticed this, and it did bother them. I mean, they hadn't seen Alice all morning. However, they did know that Alice typically stayed up late studying, so it wasn't all that unusual for her to sleep in. But even by her standards, 1 p.m. was very late, and so the landlord decided they would just go up to her room and make sure she was okay. And so the landlord went down the hallway to the last door, which was Alice's, and they knocked, but there was no answer. So after trying a few more times and still not getting an answer, they just reached down, turned the knob, it was unlocked, and they opened the door. And immediately, as soon as that door opened, the landlord began to gag. So there were a lot of things about Alice's pet parrot Polly that really concerned people. And Alice, who loved her bird and considered it the only thing saving her from total awful loneliness, sort of looked the other way when it came to all those concerns. However, there was one thing that Alice should not have ignored, and that was her parrot's drug problem. So in 1899, interior lighting inside of homes was almost exclusively open flames, and those flames were powered by gas. And it would turn out Polly regularly liked to inhale that gas. He would basically get high. When he was pecking at the light fixture, he wasn't doing it just to make noise or to damage it. He was doing it to turn the valve in order to suck on this gas until he basically passed out. Now, Alice did know Polly did this, but she would typically stop him while he was in the process of trying to get high and just kind of keep him from doing it. Or if after he had turned the valve and passed out, she would just move her parrot and then close the valve. Or she would keep her window open to ensure that the gas wouldn't get trapped in her room. But on this night, it was so cold outside, she shut the window, and then she fell asleep because she was so exhausted from all the studying, and it was after she had fallen asleep that Polly pecked the valve open, got high on the gas, passed out, and then the room continued to fill with this poisonous gas. So when the landlord opened up the door, the reason they gagged is they were hit by this surge of gas that had been trapped inside the room for hours. And then when they looked inside, they saw Alice's body lying on the ground by the bed, not moving, and then at the landlord's feet, flattened on the ground with their beak wedged under the crack at the bottom of the door, was the parrot. Alice would die from inhaling the gas, but the parrot survived because he was able to make his way over to the door and breathe in that fresh air. And so the parrot recovered and would continue to huff gas whenever it got the chance. When you are refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. Late one night in September of 1993, 43-year-old Linda Gowdy suddenly startled awake inside of her bed in her home in Stoneham, Massachusetts. She had just had this really horrible nightmare about how she was going to die. So in a few weeks, Linda and her boyfriend, whose name was Tim, were planning to go on a Caribbean cruise. And in Linda's dream that she just had, she had been on that vacation, and during that trip, she had basically seen herself dying in a car. And this dream, I mean, it was no ordinary dream. It had been so vivid, so awful, that even now, she knew she was awake, but her heart was still racing. She was still dripping sweat. It was like she couldn't fully escape from this nightmare. And as she's just kind of sitting there with these horrible thoughts in her mind, she began to realize that this was no ordinary dream. This was a premonition. So Linda was a doctor. She was an obstetrician and gynecologist who worked at a hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. And by all accounts, she was excellent at her job. Not just because she was smart and experienced, but also because she was just naturally intuitive and had this sort of like sixth sense when it came to her work. In a lot of cases, trusting her gut and going off of her intuition had actually saved the lives of her patients and their babies. And so she had sort of developed a reputation for being this way, and it had led to many patients actually traveling to her from all over the region to have their babies or just to see her in general, because it just sort of seemed like she was the person who could handle any problem, mostly because she would get ahead of it and sort of predict complications and treat them before they became complications. But this sixth sense that she had did not just pertain to work. She also would have, these sort of gut feelings or premonitions, like the dream she had just had, about her personal life. And almost always, her intuition on these things or her visions of the future would pan out to be right. So Linda knew that in order to literally protect herself, she needed to cancel her trip to the Caribbean. And even though she knew this was the right call, it didn't stop it from being hugely disappointing. She'd planned this whole trip, she'd been really looking forward to it, as was her boyfriend Tim, and also she sort of felt like this was an important trip for her relationship with Tim. She had been with Tim now for 4 years, and he too was a doctor, and they spent all their time together at the hospital. They both worked at the same hospital, but lately they'd been struggling and fighting a little bit more. Tim had sort of become pretty overprotective of her, like he was becoming sort of like controlling. And so it was just sort of exhausting dealing with their relationship issues. And this trip to the Caribbean, she saw as like this easy way to like get out of their normal lives and work on their issues, but in a happy sort of fun environment. It felt like they needed it for their relationship. But now Linda knew she would not only have to break the news to Tim that they were going to go ahead and cancel this trip, but also she would need to go find something else, some other way for her and Tim to reconcile, call it a different vacation or some other outing or something to like break the norm, which had become sort of toxic. So on this night, eventually Linda calmed down from the shock of waking up to this horrible nightmare, and she laid back down and she just told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. Like, this was obviously bad, but at least she wasn't going to die in a car crash in the Caribbean. A few weeks later, on the night of September 30th, Linda stormed down the hallway of the hospital where she worked towards her office. Linda was fuming. So she should have been leaving for her trip to the Caribbean with Tim in just a few days, but she had gone ahead and canceled the cruise because of her dream, which Tim was very annoyed with her about. He'd been vocal about the fact that her reason for canceling this trip was ridiculous, and it had made things really tense between them, and it was already tense between them, so this is like doubly bad. And now, just a few minutes ago, they had actually run into each other in the hospital hallway because they both worked there together, and they had gotten into this huge fight about the cancellation of this trip, and other coworkers had actually overheard it. And so now Linda was not only mad, but also embarrassed, that other people saw her fighting. And so as soon as she got into her office, she just slammed the door behind her and sat down and tried to focus on her work, reviewing patient charts and other things like that, but she just couldn't. Now, Linda knew that canceling this trip was the right thing to do. She was sure that if she had gone to the Caribbean, she and maybe even Tim would have died in a car. Like, she knew that she was preventing that. But at the same time, she also just hated how this premonition was now further complicating her relationship. And so now Linda just told herself to calm down. She took a few deep breaths and told herself, you have other things that are coming up that will help distract her from the drama of her relationship and this trip. Like, she had a massage she had booked for herself on her day off tomorrow, and she also had her college reunion this weekend. 2 things she was definitely looking forward to that so far anyways, she had not had a premonition about, so she had not canceled. Finally, around 8:15 p.m., when Linda's shift finally came to an end and she had left the hospital to make her way home, she actually was in pretty good spirits. Even though she had certainly not resolved things with Tim, they were still very much fighting. This Caribbean trip really had become a pain in both of their sides. Despite all that, Linda was determined that, she's not going to let this be just a constant drag on her life. She needs to just live her life and just go forward, and in time, things will sort themselves out. 4 days later, on the afternoon of Monday, October 4th, one of Linda's friends was driving towards the hospital where Linda worked. And this friend was very worried about Linda, since she hadn't heard from Linda since they spoke on the phone last Thursday, which in and of itself was not a particularly big deal, since they didn't speak every day. But this friend had also spoken to one of Linda's coworkers that morning, who was also worried about Linda, because Linda apparently didn't show up for work that morning, and the staff at the hospital were very worried, and they had even sent someone to Linda's house to check on her to make sure she was okay, but she wasn't home. And Linda, she rarely missed work, and if she did, she called in. And so to find out that she hadn't called in and nobody knew where she was, combined with the fact that this friend has not heard from her, like, the friend is thinking something's wrong here. And so they were going to the hospital to basically get together with their coworkers to just get to the bottom of this, to figure out what happened to Linda. But now, as the friend turned into the hospital's parking lot, she could immediately see that something was terribly wrong here, because the lot was crawling with police officers. They'd completely roped off the whole area, and then there was this one big group of people sort of standing over at the perimeter. And so when the friend pulled up and parked their car, she got out and she rushed over to this group to see what they were all looking at. And when she saw, she just gasped. It would turn out Linda's premonition was eerily accurate, but Linda had misinterpreted it. So on the previous Thursday, when she had left work after that long shift and she's looking forward to her massage the next day and the college reunion that weekend, she's trying not to think about the toxicity with her boyfriend Tim. She heads out, to head back home and just be done for the weekend. But she never makes it home. In fact, she never leaves the hospital grounds, because shortly after leaving the hospital, Linda was attacked and strangled to death inside of her car. Linda had been convinced that the death in the car was going to take place in the Caribbean, and so avoid the Caribbean. What she didn't realize is that it had nothing to do with the Caribbean. It was simply that she was going to die in a car, and she did. Meaning, the premonition she had was right. She did die in a car. The location was just wrong. So Linda's boyfriend, Tim Stryker, was the only suspect in her murder. He had no alibi, and he still went on that cruise to the Caribbean without Linda, right after her body was found. And he was later caught paying a witness to give the police false information about seeing Linda with another man at the time of her death. However, Tim was never officially charged with Linda's murder and denied all involvement. However, he was convicted of perjury and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, where he would die in 2011. On a spring evening in 1705, a middle-aged man named John McCall sat by his wife's bedside in Lurgan, Ireland, crying so hard he could barely catch his breath. His wife, Marjorie, had unfortunately just passed away minutes ago from what appeared to be a horrible fever. So John was actually a doctor, and a few days ago, when his wife came down with this fever, even though John had not been able to actually diagnose what was causing her fever, what he did know is that the fever was just ravaging her body and it was going to kill her. And so over the next couple of days, John just had to watch in horror as his wife basically just shut down. And now, in some ways, her death was like a mercy, but it was still devastating for John, in part because he felt so helpless. Like, he's a doctor and he couldn't save his wife. But now, despite how unfair this whole thing seemed, John had to kind of like pick up the pieces. I mean, his wife in many ways was like his whole world. They had kids, they had grandkids, they were only in their 50s, but much of those 50 years have been spent together. And so now it's like he was this lost soul. And so he just looked down at his wife and he just reached out and he grabbed her hand, the hand that he was so familiar with, and he squeezed it. And it was just limp. And it made it even more upsetting that like she was really gone. And then he looked at her actual hand and he saw the beautiful gold wedding ring that he had saved all this money for, that they both had loved so much. Just seeing that ring on her finger, on that limp hand of hers, it really reinforced the finality of this moment. He couldn't believe this had happened, but it was real. His wife really was gone. And so now, as John continued to cry and squeeze his wife's hand and just sort of reflect on this horrible situation, he also, in tandem, knew that he had to start thinking about her funeral. He would have to plan it really quickly so they could bury her really quickly. So at this time in Ireland, it was traditional to hold a multi-day wake when somebody died so that friends and relatives could have time to pay their respects before the actual burial took place. But if somebody died from disease, like obviously John's wife had, something had caused the fever, he didn't know what, but it had to be some sort of disease. If that was the case, the wake was off the table, and the person was buried pretty much right away just to prevent the sickness from spreading further. But even though John knew this, he couldn't quite bring himself to face that reality, the idea that his wife would be in the ground as soon as like tomorrow. But for right this second, John did not get up and, start making arrangements here. He just wanted to soak up the last few moments he had with his wife before she was in the ground. The following day, John stood beside his wife's casket as it was lowered into the ground at their local cemetery in front of a crowd of other mourners. Even though Marjorie, because of the disease factor, had not had a wake, John had still expected to spend this day focused primarily on grieving and thinking about all the things he loved about his wife. But Instead, he found himself on this particular day very fixated on something else: his wife's wedding ring. So John really wanted his wife's wedding ring, just to have something to remind him of Marjorie, and he loved that ring. It was something that meant a lot to him. But pretty much right after Marjorie had died, as part of the decomposition process, her fingers had begun to swell really badly, and he could not remove the ring from his wife's finger. Nobody could. Other people tried, they couldn't do it. And so ultimately, the decision was made to just bury her with the ring. And so, of course, that in and of itself was sad for John. He really wanted that ring. But also, as John stood there watching her casket get lowered into the ground with this ring inside, he was worried that now her gravesite could potentially become a target for grave robbers. Now, grave robbing has been a thing as long as there have been graves, but it was especially common in Ireland in the early 1700s when the story took place, because the country at the time was experiencing widespread famine and poverty, and people were desperate. And so things like gold wedding rings inside of graves became things worth taking. And so John just felt like, am I always going to be worried that my wife's final resting place is going to at some point be disturbed? But, by the time Marjorie was actually buried that day and people had sort of moved on, as much as John really wished that ring wasn't in there, that he had it, there was nothing he could do. And so he decided he would just try to honor his wife's memory in other ways. That night, John was back in his home in front of the fire with his kids and his relatives all around him. And they were all crying and laughing and sharing their favorite memories of Marjorie. And then every time someone told a story about Marjorie, they would all lift their drinks and they would toast to her. Now, for John, this was very cathartic. I mean, this definitely was helping him grieve. But John was also just exhausted from his grief, and also the whirlwind of the last few days and just how wretched they had been. And so even though people definitely were intending to stay up for quite a while here, John, at some point in a lull in all the stories and laughter and crying, he stood up to head off to bed. But as soon as he did, as he began leaving the crowd and they're all kind of watching him, he heard a knock at the door. And so John sighed and headed towards the door, assuming it had to be, one or more mourners who want to come in and pay their respects and just sort of be there for him. But when he opened the door, it was not a mourner. It was something else entirely. And when he saw what was out there, it made his breath catch in his chest, and then suddenly he felt this shooting pain rocketing through his chest. Then he felt his legs buckle underneath him, and before he knew it, he was falling to the ground. It would turn out John had been right to be worried about the fact that his wife was buried with her wedding ring, because not long after she was laid to rest, word had gotten out that there was this ring inside of her grave, and grave robbers, they dug her up. But just like John and everybody else who tried, the grave robbers also could not get the ring to come off of Marjorie's swollen finger. So they had to cut off her finger to get the ring. But when they did that, a very unexpected thing happened. Marjorie sat up and started screaming. So even though John was a doctor, he had been wrong when he thought she had died. I mean, he wasn't the only one. Lots of people thought she had died. However, nobody caught it, and they were so quick to bury her because they were fearful of whatever had caused her fever, that disease, that it would continue to spread, that they buried her while she was alive. Just nobody knew. And then those grave robbers, when they cut off her finger, well, the pain of having her finger lopped off basically jolted her out of this catatonic state she was in, and she sat up and she was fully alive again. But when Marjorie basically stumbled from the cemetery, fresh from her grave, back to her home to tell her husband that, hey, I'm still here, when John opened the door and he saw his wife standing there covered in dirt and missing a finger and looking horrible, he was so shocked and so scared that he had a heart attack, and he actually died. John was buried in the same plot that Marjorie had just been dug out of. And Marjorie, despite what happened to her, she went on to live for many more years, just without her ring finger. And then when she finally did die, she was buried in the same cemetery and was given a headstone with the inscription, "Lived once, buried twice." That headstone is still at Shankill Cemetery in Ireland today. On the afternoon of Wednesday, November 17, 2010, a 54-year-old woman named Diane Zaleski pulled her car into her driveway in Union Township, New Jersey, which is a small suburb of New York City. Diane was just about to get out of her car and go inside when her cell phone inside of her purse began to ring. She opened it up and she looked at her phone, and the caller ID said it was her sister-in-law, Debbie. So Diane picked it up and she said hello, and immediately Debbie asked her for a favor. She said that she needed someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment the next day, and she was wondering if Diane could do that. And Diane did not have to consult her calendar to know that her schedule tomorrow was wide open. Just a few months ago, she'd retired from her 17-year career as a legal secretary and then had moved to this particular neighborhood to be closer to her aging parents and her brother. And so her only job at the moment was helping out her family, which didn't take up all her time, and tomorrow she was free. So Diane told Debbie, that she'd see her tomorrow, and then the pair hung up. After that, Diane gathered up her things and got out of her car, and then as she was about to walk inside of her home, she stopped and just turned around and looked out at her new neighborhood. And it was really nice here. The block was full of all these beautiful homes and well-kept lawns. This was just a really nice place to live. And so as she was just, staring out at the scene, she saw the woman who lived across the street, her name was Mrs. Yearwood, dragging her garbage cans down to the curb. And so Diane, she waved to Mrs. Yearwood and smiled, and also made a mental note to ask Mrs. Yearwood if her son, whose name was Arnell, was free to shovel her, Diane's walkway tomorrow, because that night it was supposed to snow. Later that same night, sometime after 10 p.m., Diane was in bed with her laptop open, scrolling through messages on her online dating profile. Now, dating was sort of a normal part of Diane's life. She'd gone out with plenty of men over the years, and she still got hit on pretty aggressively at bars, and she'd even been proposed to once. But despite, meeting lots of men and liking quite a few of them, she just had never gotten married. These days, Diane met most of the men that she went on dates with online, like on a dating site. And on these sites, men seemed to always be messaging her to ask her out. And so far, of the men she actually wound up seeing, only a few had been creeps. And so over time, Diane had sort of cultivated this small roster of men that she kept in touch with and, would meet up with for dates. And so now Diane clicked on the profile for one of the men that was on her roster. It was a man named Kyle Porter, and she was just about to message him this very flirty message when she heard her doorbell downstairs ring. And when she heard this, she was sort of surprised because she definitely was not expecting anybody. But, she still obviously got out of bed and got herself together and headed downstairs to see who it was. And when she unlocked and opened the door, the person standing outside in the cold was somebody that she immediately recognized. Now, she really had no idea what they were doing here right now, but she told them to, come inside and then asked them, what's going on. And then this visitor started talking, and they would say something that Diane never expected. The following day, around noon, Diane's 91-year-old father, Stanley Zaleski, was at home watching TV when his phone rang. He picked it up and he heard the voice of his daughter-in-law, Debbie. And Debbie sounded really worried. And she quickly explained to him that Diane had agreed to drive her to a doctor's appointment that morning, but she hadn't shown up. And now, she was reaching out to Diane, but she wasn't answering, and she also wasn't responding to texts. And Stanley, much like Debbie, was very surprised by this, because this was not like Diane at all. So he told Debbie that he would go over to Diane's place right now and check on her, since after all, he lived a lot closer to Diane than Debbie did. Then they hung up, and Stanley yelled for his wife to come on with him. 20 minutes later, Stanley and his wife, Diane's mom, walked up to the front door of Diane's house. As soon as they got there, Stanley began pounding on the door, yelling for his daughter, but there was no answer. And so eventually, after looking at his wife, and they both are like, what's going on here? He reached down and he tried the door handle to see if the door was unlocked, and he found that it was. So he turned the handle and he just pushed the door open, and immediately his eyes were drawn to the ground inside the house, like right in the foyer, because it was all red. There was blood everywhere. A wave of nausea came over Stanley, and he had to grab the door frame to steady himself. But then after a moment, he turned to his wife, who was right next to him, and he just said, "Stay right here. I'm going to go in and look around." And then he stepped inside, and as he moved further into the foyer, which again, there's just like blood splattered everywhere, he began to notice there were piles of strange white dust that he didn't recognize sort of amongst the blood. There's no sign of Diane, like it's silent in the house. But as Stanley's standing there, he sees that there's also what appears to be a pretty clear trail, like something had been dragged through the blood and was sort of pulled towards the back of the house. And so Stanley, with his heart racing, he began walking, like following this trail of whatever got dragged through the house, and it made its way to the top of the stairs that led down into the basement. And then when Stanley looked down into the basement, he saw something at the foot of the stairs, like a heap of something that was down there. And after a minute, once his eyes adjusted to the dark down there, he saw it was his daughter. And at that point, he sort of staggered back and he yelled out for his wife to call 911. Half an hour later, around 1 p.m, Detective Robert Henderson of the Union County Homicide Task Force drove his police cruiser into a very nice, quiet neighborhood. His partner, Detective Mike Minacchio, was sitting in the passenger seat. And at some point, Henderson, he pulled up to the snow-covered curb in front of a large house that was in the process of being roped off with crime scene tape. Henderson immediately noticed there was an elderly man and woman being interviewed by officers in the front yard of this house. And as soon as Detective Henderson and his partner got out of their cruiser, one of the officers who was out and about ran over to brief them on what the police knew so far. He explained that the elderly man and woman were the parents of the victim, Diane Zaleski. Diane lived alone, this was her home, and her parents had come over earlier and found her foyer covered in blood, and Diane was found lying dead at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. Henderson asked if there were any signs of a break-in or a robbery, and the officer said no, but he warned them that the scene inside the house was really unusual. It seemed like the killer, after killing Diane, had sort of been all over the house, clearly taking a lot of time to both clean up and also contaminate the scene to make it harder for investigators. And when Henderson heard this, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because in his experience, most killers tried to get away from the crime scene as quickly as possible. They wouldn't just linger like that. And so at this point, Henderson turned to Minacchio and was like, how do you want to split this up here? And Minacchio said he would stay and interview Diane's parents. That way Henderson could go inside and inspect the rest of the crime scene. When you are refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. Moments later, Henderson stepped through the front door of Diane's house, and he saw the huge amount of blood in the foyer. There was so much that he assumed the murder must have taken place right here in the entryway. There was also a lot of white dust all over the floor that Henderson recognized as fire extinguisher powder. Henderson couldn't see any evidence of a fire, so he guessed that what must have happened here is the killer had sprayed down the area with a fire extinguisher in an effort just to contaminate the scene. Henderson noticed there was a trail of blood that sort of left the entryway and headed towards the back of the house. And so he followed it through the hallway into the kitchen, and in there he saw forensic techs standing around the kitchen sink, which was full of all the soapy water. And as he walked in, Henderson, one of the techs pulled a woman's wallet out of the sink and then set it open on the counter to dry. Henderson walked over to check the ID and saw that it was Diane's wallet. And so this was obviously very weird, but it got even weirder when the forensics tech reached back into the water and then fished out something else, a TV remote. And so at this point, Henderson and the techs realized that what must be going on here is the killer must have been dumping these items in the soapy water to try to clean off fingerprints or DNA. But after seeing all this, it made Henderson really wonder, what state would the body be in when he found it? If the killer's going to these many lengths with just ancillary evidence, what did they do to the body? And so after chatting with the techs for a few minutes about how strange this whole thing was, Henderson turned and continued following that trail of blood on the ground, and it led him to the door that went down to the basement. And so he looked down into the basement, And he saw at the foot of the stairs there was a forensic specialist taking photos of Diane's body, which was, right at the foot of the stairs. When Henderson went down there and actually got a look at Diane's body, he had been bracing for, her body to be in pretty rough shape considering what he had seen upstairs, but he was still taken aback by just how violently Diane clearly had been attacked. Her torso, her neck, and her face were covered in literally more stab wounds than he could even count. And then as Henderson leaned in even closer, he saw there were additional bruises on Diane's face and pretty clear defensive marks on her limbs that told him that there had definitely been a pretty big struggle. Also, some of Diane's clothes had been removed, which made Henderson wonder if Diane had been sexually assaulted. And as awful as that obviously is, if that was the case, the upshot was that there was a good chance the killer's DNA could be recovered from her body. However, at the same time Henderson is thinking this, he began to notice a very harsh chemical smell that was clearly coming from Diane's body. And that's when he spotted a bottle of toilet cleaner that was right nearby, and he realized that the killer must have dragged Diane's body down here and then splashed it with chemicals in yet another attempt to destroy evidence. And so at this point, Henderson was getting pretty worried, because the killer clearly had taken a lot of steps to cover their tracks. And if they had done a thorough enough job and the police couldn't find any usable fingerprints or DNA, they'd be relying primarily on witnesses, which are not necessarily hugely reliable. So Henderson just really hoped that was not going to be the case here. But if it was, he just prayed that someone in the neighborhood had seen something. 10 minutes later, Henderson walked down the icy sidewalk, canvassing the neighborhood with his partner, Detective Manacchio. And as they walked, Manacchio filled Henderson in on the talk that he had just had with Diane's parents. What he'd learned was that Diane had recently moved to this neighborhood and that she also dated a lot, mostly men that she met online. And the fact that she dated a lot of people certainly caught Henderson's attention, because all the evidence that they had found so far in Diane's house suggested that she had been killed by somebody she knew. There were no signs of forced entry, and there was evidence of a long, very deliberate cleanup. So the killer had clearly felt comfortable enough to stick around after the murder and had probably known Diane was single, so they were not going to be interrupted. And so Henderson sort of filed these thoughts away as he and his partner arrived at the next house on the block. Henderson knocked, and a moment later, an elderly woman answered the door. And at that point, Henderson explained about Diane's murder, and then he asked her if she had seen anything suspicious around Diane's place the previous day. Cars parked outside or, strange people coming and going, anything. Now, this woman was immediately startled by the news of a murder in this neighborhood. That definitely was the primary reaction she had. But, she quickly recovered and said that no, she hadn't seen anything. However, she did remember seeing some kids playing in the yard across the street from Diane's, so maybe they had seen something. Moments later, Henderson and Manacchio stood on the front porch of the house that was directly across the street from Diane's, and they were speaking to a woman in her 50s who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Yearwood. When Henderson explained about the murder across the street, Mrs. Yearwood gasped and said that, she hadn't known Diane particularly well. She was new to the neighborhood, but she had always been so friendly to her and her family, and in fact, Diane had even paid Mrs. Yearwood's son to help with some small chores around her house. At this point, Henderson sort of, shifted the conversation and just got to the point. He told her that he had heard that there had been some kids playing outside this house the previous day. And were the kids home? Because he really wanted to speak to them to see if they had maybe heard or seen anything strange on Diane's property the day before. Mrs. Yearwood immediately nodded and turned around and walked into the back of the house, and then a moment later came back with an 11-year-old boy who looked very nervous. And so Henderson, to disarm him, immediately knelt down and touched him on the shoulder and just said, "Look, we're trying to catch a bad guy." And then Henderson pointed across the street and asked the boy had he seen anything strange at Diane's house the day before. The boy, at this point, looked past Henderson over at Diane's house and then back at Henderson, and he just shook his head and said no. And at this point, Henderson, he felt his stomach sink, because with a deeply contaminated crime scene and apparently no good witnesses, this case was already off to a horrible start. Around noon the following day, December 19th, Detective Henderson sat in his office reading through Diane Zaleski's autopsy report. He'd been anxiously waiting for this file all morning, but unfortunately, it did not contain much information that he had not already guessed. Diane's time of death was estimated to be between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., so 11 to 14 hours before her parents found her body. She had been strangled and beaten and also stabbed more than 40 times. The damage was so severe, the medical examiner couldn't actually say which injury killed her. And also the knife that was used in the attack had never been found. They also couldn't tell if Diane had been sexually assaulted, because the chemicals that had been splashed on her body had destroyed any DNA the killer might have left behind. The forensics team also had not pulled any usable fingerprints from the house, thanks to the killer's cleanup efforts. But they did find something that was even better. There were a few drops of fresh blood at the crime scene that did not match Diane's DNA, and early tests showed that they came from an adult male. Now, it was possible that this blood was from someone other than the killer, but Henderson didn't think so. There had clearly been some sort of a struggle between the killer and Diane, so it seemed likely that Diane had managed to wound the killer and maybe draw blood, and maybe this was it. And so now, the game had changed. Henderson's next task would be to collect DNA samples from all the men closest to Diane and compare them to this fresh blood at the crime scene. Now, the digital forensics team had Diane's laptop, and they were working really hard to try to access her online dating profile to try to figure out who she'd been chatting with, because those were definitely some people they might want to compare DNA with. But while Henderson, thought that was great, he wasn't going to wait. He felt like he needed to move on this right now, and he figured if he wanted some answers about who Diane was potentially dating or seeing, or maybe who some of her exes were, he actually knew where he could go to start. Around 9:30 the next morning, Henderson was sitting in a coffee shop across from Diane's best friend, Joanne Govea. Joanne was clearly still processing the murder, and at the moment, she really seemed more angry than anything else. But she told Henderson that she would help any way she could, and that she did know all about the men who were in Diane's life. But of all her romantic partners, there was really only one who concerned her. His name was Mike Prunell, and according to Joanne, he'd been Diane's landlord years ago. After Diane had moved into his building, he'd started showering her with gifts and bugging her to go out with him, and they had ended up dating for a while, but when Diane ended things, Mike had been furious, and Diane had actually had to move to a new place just to get away from him. Now, this obviously got Henderson's attention, and he made a mental note to find Mike as soon as possible. But there was another name that he wanted to ask Joanne about as well. During the search of Diane's house, detectives had found her wallet in the kitchen sink. It had been sitting in the water. And inside of the wallet had been Diane's ID, some credit cards, and then there was also this soggy business card for someone named Mark Baker. And so Henderson asked if Joanne recognized that name. And Joanne said, "Yeah, I do." She said Diane had met Mark Baker at a bar, and they had talked and exchanged contact info, but Joanne didn't know if they'd ever actually followed up. And so Henderson and Joanne spoke for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped it up, and Henderson thanked Joanne for the help. And then as he was leaving, he decided that, he really needed to speak to both Mark and Mike, but he would start with Mark because he had his business card. Later that afternoon, Henderson led Mark Baker into the police station's interview room. He offered Mark a seat and a bottle of water, which Mark accepted before asking, what's going on? What is this all about? Mark definitely was pretty annoyed to have been asked to come down here in the middle of the workday with, virtually no explanation. So Henderson decided to just get straight to it. He explained that he was investigating a murder. Then he pulled out a photo of Diane, put it on the table, and slid it over to Mark. Now, as Henderson did this, he was sort of studying Mark for any sort of reaction when he saw Diane's picture. But Mark just sort of glanced at the photo and then back up at Henderson, and he said, "Am I supposed to know who this is?" And this totally caught Henderson off guard. Henderson told him that the woman's name was Diane, and he knew that Mark had met her at a bar not that long ago. But Mark just shook his head and insisted that that had not happened. He said he definitely didn't know Diane, and he also would not have chatted her up anywhere, because she apparently was not the kind of, quote, target he usually went for. And that word, target, sort of hung in the air very uneasily between them for a long time. And then eventually Henderson just sort of, cleared his throat and asked if Mark would be willing to give a DNA sample. And Mark flat out refused. But this only made Henderson even more determined to get a sample. Now, he couldn't force it without a warrant, but he had another idea. Mark had been drinking from that water bottle that he had given him when he first came in, and he just hoped if Mark left it behind, Henderson could scoop it up and send it off for testing. So he told Mark that he was free to go. But Henderson was disappointed when Mark did not throw the bottle away. Instead, he put the cap back on, pocketed the bottle, and he left. Now, Henderson obviously couldn't prove this, but just from the looks of it, the decision to take the bottle like that, it felt deliberate. And it reminded him of just how careful Diane's killer had been to remove forensic evidence from the crime scene. So he gave Mark a few seconds head start, and then eventually Henderson got up and actually followed Mark out of the station, but kept his distance so that he wouldn't notice he was behind him. And Henderson very carefully trailed Mark all the way down the block, and then at some point when Mark stopped and sort of looked around for a moment, Henderson froze until he realized Mark was just checking street signs. And then, Mark just kept on walking and Henderson kept on trailing until eventually Mark pulled out that bottle and he chucked it onto the ground. And then as soon as Mark had walked down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared, Henderson ran over, put on a rubber glove, picked up that bottle, and went right back to the police station. And then as soon as he got there, he put it inside of an evidence bag and he sent it off to the crime lab for testing. That evening, around 6 p.m., Henderson was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen in total frustration. He was reading the results of a database search for Diane's ex-boyfriend and former landlord, Mike Purnell, and he was running into a problem. Henderson could not find anybody with that name. A moment later, Henderson heard a knock at his door, and he called for whoever it was to come on in. And then when the door opened, he saw his partner, Detective Minacchio, standing there with a middle-aged man. And Minacchio explained that this guy was Diane's brother, Ron Zaleski, and he was here to give whatever information he could about Diane's personal life. And Henderson immediately perked up because he realized that, Ron very likely knew Diane's ex-boyfriends and any current boyfriends. So as they sat down, Henderson asked him if he remembered a man named Mike Purnell. And Ron immediately paused and looked really surprised, and then said, yeah, he knows exactly who Mike is. Because at one point, Mike had actually asked their father for his blessing to marry Diane. According to Ron, none of the family had been in love with that idea, because Mike had seemed like a really shady guy. In fact, he had such a long rap sheet that he didn't even go by his real name. Two days later, on November 22nd, Detective Henderson sat in the interview room across from the man who called himself Mike Purnell. His real name was Lou Hubbard, and at this point, Henderson knew that amongst his rap sheet was a conviction for domestic violence against his ex-wife. Apparently, he had savagely beaten her, and Henderson knew that obviously in this murder case, Diane had been savagely beaten, so there's, a similarity there. Now, Henderson had not told Lou that they knew his real name, and he also hadn't told Lou why he was even here, and Lou hadn't asked. And at the moment, Lou was just sort of leaning back in his chair, sort of like making light of this whole thing, like it was totally hilarious that he was being held inside of a police station. At some point, Henderson asked Lou where he had been on November 17th, and Lou just sort of shrugged and said he couldn't remember anything about that day, like it didn't stand out at all to him. At this point, Henderson pulled out that photo of Diane and he slid it across the table to Lou. And Lou, he just glanced at it and then slid it back across the table and said he had no idea who that was. And to Henderson, this was just completely unbelievable, like literally not believable. Because he knew that Lou had literally proposed to Diane, this woman in the photo. So there was no way he did not recognize her. He had to be lying. At this point, Henderson stood up from the table and he looked at Lou and said, "If you want to keep playing dumb, that's fine." Then he stood up and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and he yelled out for his partner, Detective Minacchio, to bring him the file on Lou. And then a moment later, Minacchio ran down the hall, he handed over the file, and then Henderson went back to the table. Henderson, calm as could be, opened up the file and then began telling Lou that, "I know your name's not Mike Purnell. It's Lou Hubbard. I know all about you. I know that at one point you were going to propose or did propose to this woman, Diane, the one in the photo, the one you claim not to know. We know all about it. We know about your criminal record, your domestic violence conviction. We know all about it." At this point, Lou's entire demeanor had changed. It was like he knew he'd been caught. And he just nodded and said, yeah, he knows who she is. And he also said that he had seen on TV that she had been murdered, but he swore he didn't do it. Now, Henderson really didn't believe the guy because he's just caught him lying. But he told him, hey, if you really didn't do it, there's an easy way to prove that. Give us a DNA sample, like literally right now. And after a long pause, Lou agreed. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, November 23rd, Detective Henderson was working at his desk when his phone rang. When he looked at the caller ID and he saw the extension, he knew it was the crime lab, and he assumed they must be calling to confirm receipt of Mark Baker and Lou Hubbard's DNA samples they had sent over. But when Henderson answered, the analyst on the line explained they were actually calling with an update from Digital Forensics. The digital team had finally accessed the browsing history on Diane's laptop, and they'd found some activity from the hours after Diane was killed. It looked like the killer, while hanging around inside of Diane's house after the murder, had viewed some pornographic websites, and then they'd also used Diane's credit cards to try and order a MacBook and an iPhone, and they had set the delivery address for these items for Diane's house. Now, Henderson was sort of taken aback by all of this, but what stood out was, well, if they're ordering these items to the scene of the crime, it means they planned on coming back to the scene of the crime. But there was also more. Apparently, the digital forensics team had finally gotten into Diane's dating profile, so now they could see everyone that she had messaged or gone out with in the past. And there were literally dozens and dozens of names. And so when Henderson heard that, he knew that now, there were all these new suspects, dozens of them. They would have to swab and question every one of those men. And so now the case had just totally exploded. Around noon on December 2nd, 2010, so about 2 weeks after Diane's murder, Detective Henderson sat in his car outside of an office building in Newark, New Jersey, watching the front entrance. He'd been there all morning, waiting for a worker whose name was Kyle Porter. Kyle was one of the men that Diane had been messaging with online before she was killed. Henderson had already spoken to him over the phone, and Kyle had actually confirmed that he had been to Diane's house just a few weeks before the murder. But what really made Henderson suspicious of Kyle was just the fact that he had refused to submit a DNA sample, even after Henderson explained that doing so would help clear him as a suspect. So now, as Henderson finally saw Kyle step out of the building and head for the parking lot, Henderson got out of his car and literally ran over to intercept him. And as he did, Henderson flashed his badge, and Kyle for a second looked like he maybe wanted to run, but instead he just sort of stammered that he was going to be late for his lunch meeting, sort of suggesting I can't talk to you right now. But Henderson had not waited around all morning just to leave empty-handed here, so he told Kyle that he could either give a sample right now and be on his way, or they could talk again when Henderson came back with a warrant for Kyle's arrest. And Kyle seemed terrified by that idea, so he sighed and said, okay, I'll give you a sample. 4 days later, on the morning of December 6th, Henderson was out jogging before his shift when his cell phone rang. He saw that it was the crime lab calling, so he stopped what he was doing and he answered the call. A forensic analyst from the lab was on the line, and he explained that he was calling because they just finished with the first batch of Henderson's blood samples. This batch included the samples for Mark Baker, the man who Henderson had to secretly trail just to pick up his water bottle, as well as Diane's ex-boyfriend, Lou Hubbard, aka Mike Prunell, and also Kyle Porter, the man she had met through online dating who, only after being threatened with arrest, offered up his DNA swab. And so Henderson held his breath as this analyst read off the results. And not one of them matched the blood sample from the crime scene. For a moment, Henderson thought there really had to be a mistake here, because all three of those men had been so suspicious and so uncooperative. Now, he'd always known that, the crime scene blood that he had tested their samples against maybe wasn't from the killer. But if that was true, then Henderson was really in trouble, because it meant that after all this, he had nothing. Now, the blood from the crime scene had already been tested against the state's DNA bank, and there had been no matches. And now he's got no matches here with these three suspects, and so Henderson knew he really had no choice but to keep finding and testing more suspects. And in the next few weeks and then months, he went through this process over and over, interviewing and obtaining DNA samples from the men in Diane's dating profile history and her email contacts, basically every man who had anything to do with her. He went out and interviewed and tested. In fact, over the next year, the detectives conducted more than 100 interviews and took over 80 DNA samples. But one by one, they all turned into dead ends. One morning in December of 2011, Detective Henderson was at his desk on the phone following up about a tip about Diane's case. So a month earlier, on the anniversary of Diane's death, the local news had aired a big special on the case. And then, since then, the police station had been flooded with people calling in various tips. And so now, Henderson and Minacchio had their hands full following up on all these tips, but so far they had gone nowhere. And so Henderson thanked the person he was on the phone with, even though he sort of knew that what they were telling him was not going to be useful. Then he hung up and let out a frustrated sigh. He was starting to think that he had been totally wrong at the start of this murder. That Diane's killer was not someone she knew, but maybe a random intruder who would be even harder to catch. Or even worse would be, maybe the blood they had been testing all of these suspects against for the last year, that blood maybe didn't even belong to the killer. But just then, Minacchio burst into the office and he had a big grin on his face. And he said he had just gotten a call from this woman who had a story that Henderson needed to hear. Minacchio at this point just handed Henderson his cell phone, and so Henderson put the phone to his ear, and sure enough, there was a woman on the line. And this woman explained that she had an online friend that she spoke with all the time. Now, they'd never actually met in person, but they were still pretty close, and they told each other practically everything. And a few days ago, this online friend of hers had sent a very disturbing message, where they openly admitted that they had killed Diane Zaleski. And when this woman told Henderson the actual name of this online friend of hers, he was so confused. But then it was like all at once, the world came crashing down around him because he realized that over a year ago, on the very first day he'd begun investigating Diane's murder, he had made a huge mistake. Based on forensic evidence from the crime scene and the killer's eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Diane Zaleski on the night of November 17th, 2010. The killer was very nervous as they knocked on Diane's front door, because even though they had been here before, tonight was going to be different. Diane eventually came to the door, and she opened it up, and she seemed sort of surprised to see the killer there. But, she let them inside and asked them, what's going on? What are you doing here? And the killer, they hadn't really figured out how they were going to do this. And at some point, they just sort of blurted out the thing they wanted to tell her, which was to tell Diane that they had really intense feelings about her. But as they were sort of rambling on about all these things they wanted to do with her and how they really just wanted her, Diane stopped them and told them that what they wanted was totally inappropriate and that now they needed to leave. But the killer, after being rejected, refused to leave. And then the killer began to argue. And as they did, they got angrier and angrier until they reached over and grabbed a pair of scissors on the table by the door, and they began stabbing Diane. But Diane, she immediately fought back way harder than the killer had expected, thrashing and kicking until the killer's grip on the scissors slipped. And at that point, the killer actually felt a flash of pain in their hand, and they looked down to see a bloody cut on their hand. But for the killer, this only made them more mad. The killer began to strangle her until finally she stopped moving. Once Diane was still, the killer took their hands off of her and then just sort of looked around at the incredibly bloody mess they'd made in the front of the house. They'd watched enough TV to know that their DNA and fingerprints were probably all over not just Diane's body, but all over the foyer right now. But they also knew that Diane, she lived alone, which meant that nobody was coming home anytime soon, and so they felt like they had plenty of time to clean up this mess. They started by dragging Diane's lifeless body down the hallway to the steps and then down into the basement. And then they cleaned her body with chemicals. And then after that, they went back upstairs and stripped off their own bloody clothes and started a load of laundry. And while they waited for their laundry to be done, the killer just sort of made themselves at home. They took a shower, they watched TV, they cooked and ate a bowl of pasta, and they used Diane's laptop to look at pornography and also do some online shopping with Diane's credit card. And then once the killer's clothes were clean and dry, they put them back on and then collected the items that they had handled, like Diane's wallet and her TV remote, and dumped them in the sink with a bunch of soapy water. Then they went around the house blasting everything with a fire extinguisher from under the sink to destroy trace evidence, and also they went ahead and wiped down the laptop to make sure there was no DNA or fingerprints on that as well. And then finally, sometime in the early hours of the morning after the murder, the killer, after having done all they could, they just casually walked out the door into the falling snow and crossed the street and went into their mother's house. Because the killer was Arnell Yearwood, Diane's neighbor's son. So the huge mistake that investigators made at the very beginning of this investigation was when they found out that the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Yearwood, that her son apparently did chores for Diane. Well, the mistake they made, in particular Detective Henderson, was when Mrs. Yearwood went into the back of the house and came back with that 11-year-old boy that they spoke to that said he didn't see anything strange across the street the day before, they assumed that boy was Mrs. Yearwood's son, and he was the one who was doing chores for Diane. And basically, they're like looking at this kid who's totally innocent, thinking, okay, clearly this kid who's been across the street in her house is not a person of interest. He did not kill anybody. And so the son of Mrs. Yearwood was just sort of forgotten about. What they didn't realize is that 11-year-old boy was not Mrs. Yearwood's son. It was her grandson. Her actual son was a 26-year-old man, Arnell Yearwood, who was actually inside the house on that day. He was hiding in her house. But they just never clarified. They assumed the kid was her son and just sort of wrote off any chance that her son could be involved. And so Detective Henderson and Minacchio didn't put it together until over a year later when they got that tip from that woman who said her online friend confessed to the murder, and his name was Arnell Yearwood. And so ultimately, Diane let Arnell into her house on the night she was killed because she knew and trusted him. He did chores at her house. But he tried to initiate a sexual relationship with her, she rejected him, and so he killed her. Arnell Yearwood was ultimately arrested on April 7th, 2012, so about a year and a half after killing Diane. He would confess to the murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. On the morning of October 20th, 1997, a 40-year-old man named Kevin Dowling rowed a small boat across a reservoir that was near his home in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. And this reservoir was beautiful. It was quiet and peaceful out here, and the weather was perfectly cool, and the leaves on all the trees around the water were very colorful and starting to fall. And as Kevin looked around at all this incredible scenery, he knew he had chosen the exact right spot for what he needed to do. So Kevin had rented this boat to go fishing. But in reality, he was out here primarily just to have a place where he could relax and just think. So lately, Kevin's life had been incredibly stressful, and so moments of calm and peace were just very few and far between. The stress really began when, recently, Kevin had lost his full-time job. He had been an operations manager at a convenience store, and he had been fired after making just one mistake. And now he had to work the night shift at a Staples store just to support his family. And they were barely getting by. And Kevin, believe it or not, was generally speaking a very overachieving person. And so to have his life playing out the way it was, just very disappointing. And it was also just turning him into a very stressed out, angry person. And he knew that was happening. He'd been lashing out at his wife, yelling at his kids, and he had even gotten into this horrible altercation with an art gallery owner in town. And so finally, after a couple of months of just being this sort of awful person with these angry outbursts and sleepless nights as a result of all this stress, he knew he had to do something to turn things around. And so he thought this fishing trip was just what he needed. Kevin looked towards the front of the boat where there was a camera set up on a tripod. Anytime Kevin went out on these fishing expeditions, he would film himself, both to capture the moments he would catch the fish, and also because he just liked, after he'd returned from these trips, to just watch the footage all over again. It sort of brought him back to a time and place, out on the water that was just great. He liked fishing. It was peaceful. It was calm. And so he was doing that for this trip as well. Even though, right now, as he sat there, as serene as things were, he was filled with a whole lot of angst and a lot of stress and anxiety. But he figured, you know what? I'm out here. I need to put on a good performance for the camera, be the happiest version of myself I can be, so that when I return to dry land and I show this footage to my family and I refer to it myself, I don't want to see that I was so, upset while I was out here. This is supposed to be my catharsis. This is supposed to be a chance for me to decompress. So basically, he looked at the camera and sort of told himself, like, okay, smile and enjoy this trip. This is good for your mental health. And so Kevin rowed a bit further into the reservoir and he came to a spot that he thought was good. He pulled in the oars and then he reached over and turned on the camera and sort of waved and said, okay, I'm out here about to start. And then he took a deep breath and he cast his line into the water. Early the next morning, Kevin was at his kitchen table feeling extremely tired. So the day before, after he had gone fishing on the reservoir, he had a night shift at Staples. And so he did the whole shift. He comes home, he barely sleeps, and now he's back up again. And so he's just totally exhausted, eating breakfast with his wife. And so while the two of them are just sitting there in silence, eating their food, there's this sudden sharp knocking on the front door. And the two of them look at each other like, who would this be? They both didn't know. And so Kevin got up, he walked to the front door, he opened it up, and he was very surprised to see two police officers standing there. And so Kevin asked them, how can I help you? And they told him they were here because of a fight that Kevin had gotten into with that art gallery owner a few months ago. They said that the entire situation had now escalated and the police needed to get a statement. Now, Kevin did not try to deny that he had gotten into a fight with this person. So instead, he just stepped outside to speak to them alone. And pretty much the instant he was out there speaking to the cops, it was like his stomach was just in knots. I mean, it just seemed crazy that the day before he was out on the beautiful reservoir going fishing, having this sort of nice time. I mean, his life was so stressful these days, but it's like just yesterday, he had finally found some peace. He was so eager to watch back his video of him fishing. That was just a nice moment in time, a rare nice moment. And now he's got more problems, more stress being piled on. He couldn't believe it. But Kevin knew he needed to comply here. Whatever they needed, he was going to try to give it to them. And so he just asked one of the officers to please explain a little bit more about what was really going on here. This seems pretty serious. And one of the officers, he just said, look, I can't give you too many details here. But they told him there had been another altercation at the art gallery yesterday morning. And Kevin was being considered a suspect at this point because he had previously gotten into a fight with this owner. Now, for Kevin, obviously, this was not good. This was very bad. This was shocking. This is not good news. But on the other hand, when they said this happened yesterday morning, Kevin's mind immediately went to his fishing trip. He had been fishing yesterday morning. He was at this reservoir that's at least 45 minutes away from the art gallery. He had receipts from taking that boat out. He had receipts from his fish bait. He even took a video that was likely time-stamped while he was out in the water. And so Kevin tells the officers that, I have no idea what happened at the art gallery, but I wasn't involved. Whatever happened yesterday, that was not me. A few seconds later, Kevin had led the officers into his house. He had gone upstairs, grabbed his fishing bag out of his closet. He had rifled through it and grabbed all the receipts and then come back downstairs. And when he did, he saw the officers were speaking to his wife and asking her about his alibi. And she had said, yes, Kevin had been fishing. And she'd even watched a home video of his trip that he had made because he always made videos of when he went fishing. And so at this point, the officers seemed satisfied and they took the receipts as well as the videotape that Kevin's wife had mentioned. And they said they'd just be in touch if they had any more questions. Over the next few days, Kevin totally forgot about the police stuff. Whatever happened at the art gallery, that had nothing to do with him. That was totally separate. He had given the evidence over. He hadn't heard from the police. So in his mind, that's over and done with. However, on the evening of October 29th, so a little more than a week after the police had first shown up at his home, Kevin had just finished making dinner and was about to sit down and eat it with his family when the doorbell rang, followed by a series of very loud knocks. And so Kevin, he got up, sort of looked at his wife. They both exchanged a look who is this? And then he walked over to the front and through the window, he could see who it was. It was the police again. But this time, when he opened the door, they didn't ask politely for him to just make a statement. Instead, one of them immediately stepped forward and slapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists and said he was under arrest. So the real reason why Kevin's life had been so stressful, that really he couldn't get a night's sleep, that he's just constantly anxious, really didn't have to do with the fact that he had lost his job. That was part of it. But really it was the thing that caused his firing that was keeping him up at night. And that was actually his altercation with the art gallery owner a few months earlier. That altercation was actually really, really serious. It was not just he and this woman getting into a fight. No. Kevin robbed this woman and also assaulted her. And then he was subsequently arrested, lost his job because he was arrested, and then while he was out on bail, he's staring down this trial date that's looming for these charges he's been arrested for. And he knows there's footage of him, there's witness testimony, like he's gonna lose. He's got no job, like he's gonna look like a total pariah in the community. He's embarrassed, he's made this horrible decision, and like his life is already basically wrecked, and it's only gonna get worse if this goes to trial. And so what does he do? Kevin, the perfectionist who always sort of follows through on all the things in his life, to that point, he decides he needs to go back there to the art gallery and finish the job. He needs to get rid of this woman so there won't be a trial, so he won't be found guilty, so his life won't be ruined. And so, about a week ago, he did go back to the art gallery, he killed this woman, and then that same day, he goes out on the reservoir and pretends to be out there on this fishing trip. He films himself fishing because that's what he did always do, but really, it was just in order to create an alibi that would show he was out on the water, even though it was actually in the afternoon. He was not there in the morning. He filmed that video in the afternoon. He claimed it was in the morning. And basically, Kevin almost got away with it between the receipts for the boat and the bait and this video and his wife saying, oh yeah, he was fishing the day before. And Kevin was very innocent when he spoke to police. But what got him caught actually was the video. In the video, the position of the sun, which the officers picked up on, didn't make sense for it being the morning. It was too high in the sky. Like if it had been the morning, it just would have looked visibly different. And so they determined that Kevin's video was not shot in the morning. He could have filmed that at any point later in the day, which created a window that morning that he could have gone back to the art gallery and he could have killed that woman, which he did. Also, just to add credibility to this theory that Kevin had forged this video, or at least forged the time he had shot it, an expert was able to determine that the timestamps on the video had been tampered with, further clarifying that this was a fake. Kevin was found guilty not only of the robbery and assault charges that he was initially charged with, but also he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, and as of April 2026, he is still on death row awaiting execution. Just before 6 p.m. on Sunday, July 12, 1942, a man named Robert stumbled into a bar called the Green Parrot in Harlem, New York. And Robert was already very, very drunk. He'd been drinking all afternoon because he'd won a bunch of money in a dice game earlier that day, and he had just been celebrating. And now he was wandering into this bar, the Green Parrot, to keep the party going and keep on drinking. So at this point in 1942, the neighborhood where he was, Harlem, which is a neighborhood within New York City, it really struggled with a very high level of violent crime. And this bar, the Green Parrot, was very popular amongst locals. And so this bar attracted a big crowd, which often became a very rough crowd. And so because of how violent this area was, and because of all this cash that Robert had won earlier in the day, which he had on his person, Robert had decided to bring his gun with him out to the bar, like he was armed as he walked into the Green Parrot. And he was glad he was, because again, this is like a dangerous spot. But as Robert actually went inside of the Green Parrot, he found that it actually wasn't that crowded that night. Now, it was only about 6 p.m. and it would get much busier, or it usually got much busier later in the night. But at this point, even though he's very drunk, he looked around and he saw there was like maybe 20 people in there. And for Robert, this actually was kind of a good thing because it meant it would be easier for him to get up to the bar and, get served, get more drinks. And so Robert staggered his way over to the bar where the owner, Max Geller, was pouring drinks and helping customers. And so Robert, he gets up there and he looks around, and right away he actually recognized a number of people that were there at the bar. They were regulars. And then he saw actually there was one particular regular, this shorter guy, who he knew was really mean and nasty and just super aggressive, and he clocked him as a guy that he wanted to keep his distance from. And so Robert turned his attention to Max, the owner, and he sort of sloppily waved at him, trying to get his attention. And Max, who was still busy preparing drinks for others, he sort of looked up and stared at Robert and kind of, did sort of like a check of him to see how drunk he really was. And then Max served the other people, and then he walked over to Robert with sort of a skeptical look on his face, and he's like, "What can I do for you, Robert?" And Robert, he's like closing one eye, he's so drunk, he's like, "Yeah, I want a drink." And Max looked at him and he's like, "No, you're too drunk, I can't serve you." Now, at first, Robert was just defensive and was basically like, "Come on, like I'm in here all the time, and I've certainly been pretty drunk before and you've served me. I don't understand why this is different." But Max stuck to his word and he's like, "No, I'm not going to serve you. You're too intoxicated." And so slowly, Robert became angrier and angrier, and he began saying, like, "You're serving everybody else. There's guys here that are more drunk than me. Like, I don't get it. Like, you have to give me a drink." And at this point, Max, sensing just how upset Robert was, he said, "Look, now you're going to just have to leave. Like, I'm not going to serve you, and you have to leave." And Robert, he went from now just being mad to being humiliated. He's being, like, humiliated in front of the whole bar. And it was almost like he couldn't help what he did next. It was like rage coursed through his body. And almost without thinking, Robert drew his gun, aimed, and fired. And he shot Max in the face. Now, instantly, as soon as this shot rang out, the bar is just thrust into absolute chaos. People are screaming. Like 90% of the people in there had no idea this was even happening, let alone that people are shooting each other. It was just chaos. People are screaming, they're running around. And Robert, it was like he couldn't even believe what he had just done, and he just immediately pocketed and hid his weapon and sort of just backed away from the scene because, again, people aren't even sure who got shot. People are looking around. He sort of began to blend into the crowd, and then as soon as he could, he just turned and ran out of the bar. About a half an hour later, around 6:30 p.m., an investigator with the New York City District Attorney's Office named Louis Panuco hurried down the sidewalk toward the Green Parrot, which at this point was swarming with police officers. Panuco, who had just been called to the scene, really only knew that there had been a shooting at this bar and that the victim had apparently been shot in the face but was alive, and he was on his way to the hospital. Outside the bar, Panuco could see a bunch of these police officers already interviewing a whole crowd of people, who Panuco assumed were witnesses of the shooting. And there were a lot of them. So Panuco hoped that at least one of them would have something useful to say. And so Panuco just let these officers handle this initial questioning of this group. If he needed to, he would speak to people later. But for now, he just headed inside the bar to see what was going on. And as soon as he stepped inside, another officer came up to Panuco to just give him a quick briefing. He said the bar's owner, Max Geller, was the one who had been shot, and he had been shot in the mouth, and that he was alive, but when he was taken off to the hospital, he was unconscious, so nobody could ask him what happened. Then this officer told Panuco that there had been a bunch of customers in the bar during the shooting, and that was the crowd outside. Those were the people that the officers were getting statements from. However, this officer told Panuco that so far, almost none of the people they were speaking with were cooperating. Pretty much everybody was just saying, "Oh, I don't know what happened," or "I didn't see who shot who." It was like they didn't want to tell the police what they actually knew. The only witness so far who had said anything of substance was this very short, very loud regular who even now, a half an hour after the shooting, was acting extremely agitated and just sort of like loud and very aggressive. It was the same regular that Robert, when he had first walked in, had noticed and thought, "Boy, I don't want to be around that person." This regular was just screaming that this whole thing was a robbery. That was like all he kept saying. It was a robbery. It was a robbery. But, I mean, in the eyes of the officers who were around this regular, this short, angry guy, it just sort of seemed like he was traumatized by what he saw. And so he was just repeating the word robber over and over and over again, in part likely because he was drunk, in part maybe because he was traumatized, and it was like a weird response he was having. So it was just sort of heavily discounted what he was saying. They're like, okay, maybe it was a robbery, but maybe you're just kind of out of it. But the officer told Panuco that, they searched the bar, at least they did a cursory search of the bar, and it didn't seem like anything had been taken. So it really didn't seem like this was a robbery. So again, it just seemed like this guy who was yelling about the robbery basically didn't know what he was talking about. And so at this point, Panuco, on the one hand, he was frustrated by what he was hearing, but also he really wasn't that surprised. I mean, he's thinking that, in this area in Harlem at this time, there was a huge distrust of police. I mean, most residents refused to cooperate with authorities. And so it was very likely that some of these people who were out here, not just the guy yelling about a robbery, but the other witnesses, it was very likely that at least one of them knew something. I mean, there wasn't that many of them in the bar at the time of the shooting, but it was just unclear if he would ever get any of that information. But Panuco knew he would obviously still have to try to get some information from these people. So after getting this brief from this officer, and after sort of walking around the inside of the bar for a second, Panuco headed back outside to try to talk to some of the witnesses himself. But pretty much immediately when he began speaking to these people, he saw that there definitely was like a front being put up. He just had this sinking feeling that this investigation was pretty much dead before it was even going to get started. Fast forward about a month, and Panuco is still hard at work working on this case, except the case took a turn, because the victim, Max, he fell into a coma right after the shooting, and for weeks he had been in a coma, and authorities, Panuco included, were hopeful he would wake up and he'd be able to give them additional information about what happened, give them anything, because no one by this point had given them any new information. They had basically no evidence, they had nothing. But unfortunately, Max, without regaining consciousness, just died. And so now this was not just a shooting investigation that Panuco was in charge of. He was in charge of a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation with basically no leads. Because again, it's like none of the witnesses had given them anything. All they knew is Max got shot and now he's dead. And then the only other sort of substantive thing that had come out of any of their interviews was from that short, angry guy, the regular from the bar, who had just demanded that this was a robbery. And, at first pass, they had looked around the bar. It didn't seem like anything had been taken, and they had sort of ruled out a robbery. But now, a month later, they had really looked into that angle, and they had confirmed that nothing had been taken from the bar. So this was definitely not a robbery. And so basically, Panuco had nothing. And so at this point, Panuco decided that his best bet here was actually just to basically start over, just to zoom back out and go back to square one and just see if there was something that they missed. And in fact, Panuco had brought in a new detective, a guy named John Morrissey, to help him with this new approach. Morrissey was supposed to be this incredibly smart guy who was known for thinking outside the box, something that Panuco felt like they could really use right now. And so on this particular day, Panuco had sent Morrissey to the Green Parrot to just speak to anybody that was there. Just see if he can learn anything about the shooting from people that are at the bar where this happened, like right now. Just go there and talk to people. So off Morrissey goes, and Panuco, he stayed at the station, and that day he was going to re-interview all of the patrons who had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, just to see if, maybe he could get some additional information out of them. And so far, that was not the case. Basically, all the interviews were dead ends like they had been the first time. And so, he had somebody in the room with him right now, and the interview had gone nowhere. And he's like, you know what, you can go. Like, all right, on to the next one. And so that person leaves the interview room, and Panuco, he gets up and he walks out into the hallway where all these patrons are sitting on chairs waiting to be interviewed. And as he's, getting ready to just grab the next person to speak to, he sees there are two women who were patrons in the bar who were sitting sort of halfway down the hallway, and they were talking to each other, and they were really not being careful about how loud they were speaking. Like, their conversation that they must have thought was private was loud enough that basically everybody in the hallway could hear it. But the reason it really stood out to Panuco is they weren't speaking English, they were speaking French. Except unbeknownst to these women, who likely believed nobody in this hallway spoke French, Panuco did speak French. And he could hear these women were talking about the case. They were saying that, hey, when you go in there to speak to this detective, tell him you don't know anything. Like, don't give him any information. Because if we do and we get wrapped up in this case, like, we're going to get dragged out into the public for being involved in this shooting. And what's going to happen is people are going to know that we were at that bar drinking on that night and we told our husbands we weren't. They're going to be so mad at us. Like, we gotta be quiet. Don't tell the detective anything. Just say you know nothing. And so immediately, Panuco, he walks over to these two women and he points at one of them and says, hey, you're next. Come into the interview room. And he said this in English. And so the women were kind of surprised that they were being tapped to go next, or this woman was surprised. And so she gets up and sort of waves to her friend, and she follows Panuco into the interview room. And so as soon as they sat down, Panuco, in English, says to this woman, So are you really worried that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate with me? And the woman was clearly very surprised by this question, but she just sort of feigned like maybe she didn't fully understand because, she'd been speaking French out there. She doesn't know if Pinuco knows that she does or doesn't speak English. And so she just sat there in silence and just looked back at him like she didn't really understand. And Pinuco just stared back at her and then, in perfect French, asked the same question. Like, are you worried, again in French, that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate? And at this point, the woman knew, like, the jig was up. Clearly, this detective overheard the conversation they had in the hall. That's why he's pulled me in here. I'm caught red-handed. And the woman just began to break down and cry. And then, after a few moments, without Pinuco even needing to push her to do this, she just started telling the whole story. She explained that her and her friend out in the hallway had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, and they actually did see who shot Max. She said it was this guy who was wearing a black and white checkered suit. He had gone up to the bar, and then some sort of altercation happened, and he pulled out a gun, and he shot Max, and then he quickly ran out of the bar. Now, she told Pinuco that she didn't know this guy's name, but she definitely recognized him. She said that, she had been to the Green Parrot before the night of the shooting, and she had seen this guy, and she thinks that he's just like a regular at this bar. Like, she would definitely recognize him again if she saw him. And so Pinuco at this point, he could barely contain his excitement. This was really like the first meaningful lead in the whole case. You have a suspect who apparently is a regular at the bar where the shooting took place, and he dresses in a really distinct way. He wears, flashy clothing. Like, this is a great lead. And so Pinuco, like, he's thrilled. He thanks this woman. He goes out and he grabs the other woman and he brings her in for questioning. And she would echo the same story as the first woman, that yes, they had been there. They had seen this guy. He was a regular, they thought, and he wore these flashy clothes. And so after this, Pinuco is like, I got to tell Detective Morrissey. I got to fill him in on what I've just learned. This totally changes the case. And so he ran over to Morrissey's office to see if he was back yet from the Green Parrot. But when he went in there, he saw that he wasn't. And so Pinuco, he's like, all right, I'll go back to my office and I'll start making a plan for what we're going to do next until Morrissey gets back, and then I'll brief him up then. And so Pinuco, he goes to his office. He starts excitedly making, plans of what they're going to do. And then a moment later, his door bursts open and Morrissey comes flying into the room. And he looks totally out of breath, like he's rushed to be here to tell Pinuco something. But Pinuco, he turns, and even though he sees, like, clearly Morrissey's got something to tell me, he doesn't let Morrissey talk because Pinuco, he's got this big news about the French women. And he just starts telling Morrissey all about this crazy revelation and how he caught them speaking French and they were there. And we have this suspect now. He tells him everything he knows. And so Morrissey, even though he had something big to say himself, he's sitting there listening to Pinuco go on. And at the end of it, he's like, man, that is amazing. That's awesome. Great lead. But I'll do you one better. I know the killer's name. It would turn out when police first arrived at the Green Parrot after the shooting, like on day one of this investigation, what they found was basically nothing. They have a victim and they have a bunch of witnesses, but none of the witnesses would cooperate. Like, there was no leads, no information, no real evidence. All they had was basically this one short, loud, angry guy who kept talking about a robbery. But they had sort of looked around the bar and it didn't appear like this was a robbery. And so he had been discounted. And everyone's like, well, he's traumatized. He's sort of like this angry guy who's sort of a mess. We're not going to take him seriously. What he's saying doesn't really add up. So he was kind of discounted. But it would turn out they actually just misunderstood this guy. He wasn't saying robbery, but they didn't know that at the time. They thought he was. They ruled him out. Fast forward a month, and Mr. Think Outside the Box detective, Morrissey, he goes back to the Green Parrot to see what he can learn. And so Morrissey, he's hearing this, and he was told this is what this short guy was saying the first time too. Like, this is not that surprising. But Morrissey, he thought outside the box, and he figured out what this witness actually meant. The key to doing this was really understanding exactly who this witness was and what the witness was actually capable of knowing. Because this witness, this short, angry guy, was actually a literal green parrot that the bar was named after. The parrot was the owner, Max's, pet, And he was always there in the bar. He was a regular, sitting on his perch. And the bird was a huge tourist draw because he was kind of really aggressive and could be sort of mean, and people thought it was pretty funny. And critically, this parrot had been trained to recognize the bar's regulars and refer to them by name. So when Morrissey went back to the bar and listened to the parrot again, he eventually realized the bird was not saying robber, robber, robbery, robbery, and trying to describe like what had happened. No, instead, the bird was saying Robert, the name of the person responsible, the regular who he had seen commit this crime. And wouldn't you know it, between this new information and what Penuco had learned from the two French women at the police station, they put their information together and they discovered that there really had been a regular at the Green Parrot Bar, a guy named Robert Butler, who was a 28-year-old cab driver who had fled to Baltimore right after the shooting. The detectives were able to track Robert down and confront him about the murder, and when they explained how they'd figured it all out, Robert just had one thing to say: "I never did like that bird." Robert Butler was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Green Parrot Bar eventually closed, and as for the actual Green Parrot, nobody knows what happened to him. Around 6:30 p.m. on December 10th, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff sat inside of a guard shack at the Kennecott Copper Mine in northern Utah, reading a college textbook. The shack was barely big enough for one person to sit inside of, and there were windows on all four sides looking out into the total darkness. The sun was already down, and this was a really isolated part of the mine with no lights or other buildings nearby, so apart from a little bit of moonlight on the snow, it was basically pitch black outside. Brian had worked as a security guard for this mine for a little over a year, but he'd only been stationed at this particular guard shack for a couple of weeks now, and in his opinion, it was the worst post he could have been assigned to. His job was to guard this chain link gate on a remote service road that led into the canyons. This was a really out-of-the-way entrance into the mine, which meant that not a lot of vehicles came this way. So the job was basically just really boring. But it was also simultaneously very dangerous. The Kennecott Copper Mine was known as the richest hole on Earth because of the huge amount of valuable materials buried there, including obviously copper and gold and silver. And that made it a big target for thieves. In fact, in just the past few months, more than $150,000 worth of material and equipment had been stolen from the mine. So as a result, Brian was a little bit nervous about being out here in the middle of nowhere. Not only because it was, pitch black outside, but also he was unarmed and there were no security cameras. So if he did encounter thieves, he basically had to handle it by himself, armed with nothing more than a telephone to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been, routine so far, slow and uneventful. So Brian was now just sort of passing the time studying. He was in nursing school and his final exams were coming up in a few days, so he was just sort of poring over his textbooks and notes to prepare. While he studied, he took out his thermos full of soup that he had brought for dinner. And just as he began eating the soup, the phone on his desk rang. Now, Brian immediately did want to answer the phone because he knew very likely it was his wife, Jennifer. But at the same time, right now, things at home were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had also started working nights at the mine to help support the family while he went to nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, it was hard to make ends meet. And now Jennifer was pregnant again with their second child, which was going to make things even harder financially. And the pressure of juggling school and work and parenthood had been putting a big strain on their marriage. And about a month ago, Brian had sort of reached a breaking point, and he'd actually walked out on his family. He'd left a note for Jennifer saying he just needed time alone to think. And then he had driven to his work, he had turned in his security badge and told his boss he quit. Then he had left town, and he'd spent almost a week in Las Vegas. And eventually, he'd driven all the way out to San Francisco. But while he was there, having his time alone, he'd received word that his daughter was in the emergency room with pneumonia back home in Utah. And for Brian, it was like that was his wake-up call. He realized he could not live with himself if he truly abandoned his family. And so he drove right back to Utah to be with Jennifer and to be with his daughter, who would make a recovery. And, Jennifer, she would take Brian back, despite, him walking out on the family, at least for a short time. But her accepting him back into the fold did not sort of make them return to normal. In reality, after he returned, there just was this constant sense that there was tension hanging over their relationship because of what Brian had done, abandoning them. So now, in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath, and then he picked up the ringing phone, and for a few minutes, he just chatted on the phone, until he suddenly saw something out the window, a flash of headlights coming up the road towards his guard shack. And so at this point, Brian said he had to go, he hung up, and went right outside to meet the approaching vehicle. About an hour and a half later, so around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. The shack's lights were on, but he couldn't see anybody inside of it. And Todd found this pretty odd, because Brian wasn't supposed to leave his post under any circumstance. That was sort of like the main component to the job. You stay put. But making this even stranger was Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. And this shack is so far away from every other building that really there was no way for Brian to go anywhere without his car, especially not, in the freezing cold like it was that night. So where was Brian? And so Todd, who was definitely feeling a bit apprehensive at this point, he parked his car, he got out, and he walked into the shack. And when he got in there, it's a very small space, but Brian, was not in there. But there was a hat and a half-eaten dinner on the desk inside. And so at this point, Todd felt like, we have an issue. Like, I don't know where Brian is. Something seems off. So he picked up the phone inside the shack, and he called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig drove down a snowy desert road toward the Kennecott Copper Mine. Now, everybody knew this mine was a target for thieves. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had seemingly vanished into thin air in the middle of his shift, well, Detective Lassig went out right away to investigate, because the thought was, this could have been perpetrated by thieves. Maybe, Brian's been kidnapped or something. When Lassig pulled up to the mine's main entrance, there was another vehicle parked right in front, and it flashed its headlights at him. And then a man in a security guard's uniform rolled down the driver's side window and sort of waved Lassig over. And so Lassig pulled up next to this car, and the man in this other car told Lassig that he was Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had called in about the missing guard. Then, after that, Todd started up his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so he did. He followed him off into the darkness, driving down this dark, winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennecott mine was 3 square miles wide, with rocky terrain and mountains on every side. So they were driving for a good 10 minutes before finally Lassig saw this light up ahead, which was the guard shack that Brian had been in. The two men pulled up near this shack and got out of their vehicles. And then Todd told Detective Lassig that this shack was where the guard, Brian Ruff, had last been stationed. And so Lassig, he turned on his flashlight and then aimed it at the ground right outside of the shack. But there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any footprints or tire tracks that might have helped them were now covered up. And so Lassig stepped inside of the shack. And at first glance, everything looked to be in order. There was no blood, nothing overturned, no sign of a struggle. But again, there was a hat, Brian's hat, and also Brian's half-eaten thermos of soup, his dinner, that was still just sitting on the desk, which was pretty conspicuous. And so Lassig is kind of taking the whole scene in, trying to make sense of what could have happened, coming up with maybe some theories here, looking for any clues of where to look next. And as he was doing that, the phone on the desk rang. And Detective Lassig just picked it up, and he asked who was calling. And the woman on the line sounded very surprised, and she said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to reach out to her husband, Brian Ruff. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department, and that her husband Brian had at some point this night left his post and now couldn't be found, and so he was literally looking for her husband. And so he asked Jennifer when was the last time she had spoken to Brian. And Jennifer, she was obviously taken aback by this news, but she said she had just spoken with her husband a couple hours ago. She said they were talking, and then suddenly Brian had to hang up because he said he saw a car coming up the road. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about this particular car that was approaching, or, who was driving the car or anything. But Jennifer said no, he didn't say anything, just the car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was obviously disappointed that there wasn't more information here, But he still thanked Jennifer and told her, I promise I will be in touch with you as soon as I possibly can. I'm going to go out there and find your husband. Then he hung up the phone and he turned his attention back to the scene, the inside of this very small shack. But just a few seconds after he had put the phone down, the phone rang again. And so Lassig picked it up again, and once again, it was a woman saying she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And she was asking where Brian was, but as Lassig is listening, he's thinking, this woman doesn't sound anything like the woman I just spoke to literally a minute ago, who also said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And also, this second woman clearly doesn't have any recollection of the earlier conversation. Like, these are two different people who are both claiming to be Brian's wife, Jennifer. But obviously there could only be one, so one of these women had to be lying, right? On a morning in mid-December of 1991, so just a few days after Brian Ruff's disappearance from his remote guard shack, and still he had not been found yet, Detective Manny Lassig sat down with a cup of coffee in the Ruff's dining room across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. The investigation had been moving slowly so far because, for the first few days, everyone had been hoping that Brian would just return on his own. But as the days passed and he still hadn't been heard from, that was looking less and less likely. By this point, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, claiming to be his wife, Jennifer. And he had quickly found out that one of those calls was actually from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number, which meant very likely that was the real Jennifer Ruff. But Lassig was still trying to figure out why another woman had called and impersonated her, and also, the timing of the calls was odd. It happened one right after the other. It was just a very strange coincidence. So now, as Lassig sat across from the real Jennifer Ruff, he started out by asking her where she had been on the night Brian disappeared. She told him she'd been at the hospital all night working, and then she gave Lassig names of some of her coworkers who could verify that. At this point, Lassig completely pivoted and just asked Jennifer point blank, "Is there any chance your husband could have been having an affair? Were there other women in his life? Was he acting secretive or just odd lately? Anything to indicate, that he was maybe unfaithful?" The reason Lassig asked, obviously, was because of the second woman who he knew had called and pretended to be Brian's wife. He had no idea if the real Jennifer knew, but certainly he did. And the real Jennifer, when she heard this question, she just sort of looked down and then she looked up and she said, "Yes, I am suspicious of that." She told Lassig that she and Brian had been having some real issues in their marriage lately, and in fact, just the previous month, Brian had sort of inexplicably, ran out on the family because he needed time alone, and he was gone and out of contact for that whole time until he just came back begging to be taken back. At this point, Lassig, when he heard that part, he sat back in his chair and wondered if he was just wasting his time on this case to begin with. Because if Brian had previously left and then eventually came back after being totally out of contact, well, what's to say he wasn't doing that right now? What if this was him again, sort of running off to be alone and he would just turn back up again at some point? But Jennifer must have noticed that that's sort of where Lassig's mind was going, because she rushed to add in that, the last time when he ran out for that week, he had left a note for her and even told his boss that he was quitting. There was some warning before he left. She sort of made it dramatic, but he definitely told people before he was going to be gone. In fact, she became insistent that really it was not like Brian to not give warning. For him to just vanish mid-shift like that, like he's done right now, that's not something Brian would do. He's got some faults, but that's not something he would do. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer where Brian had actually gone when he disappeared that first time. And Jennifer answered him by handing him a piece of mail from a nearby table. She explained that it was a credit card bill that had come in the mail that week, and it was addressed to Brian. And she explained that she was pretty confused when she got this, because she didn't even know Brian had a credit card. But he apparently did, and he used it while he was away to pay for hotels and meals and other expenses. And so Lassig, he pulled out the bill and began to look it over, and he saw that a lot of the charges were made in Las Vegas and San Francisco. And the amounts that were being charged to restaurants and for room service seemed a bit too large for just one person. He looked up from the bill back at Jennifer, and just from the expression on her face, he knew that they had both drawn the same conclusion. Brian, when he was away for that week, likely had not been alone. Jennifer then grabbed another piece of paper from the counter and gave that to Lassig. This was a phone bill for the family's landline, with a full list of every call that had been made and received in the past month. Jennifer said there were definitely some numbers on this list that she didn't recognize, and she thought maybe one of them could be this person that Brian had been traveling with. And as Lassig looked over this list, one of the phone numbers immediately stood out to him, because that woman who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared and pretended to be Jennifer, basically called right after the real Jennifer, that phone number that was used for the fake Jennifer was the number he was now seeing on this list. Later that same day, Lassig sat down in the living room of the house that was associated with that phone number. And sitting across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kennecott mine where Brian worked. Now, at the moment, Dale wasn't home, but it wasn't really clear when he would get home, and Lassig was really anxious to interview Christy alone, so before her husband got back. So the instant they sat down, Lassig pretty much just cut to the chase. He told Christy that he was nearly positive she and Brian had been having an affair. And then before she could say anything, he pulled out that bill that Jennifer had given him and showed her all the evidence. Christy, when she saw this, for a second looked defiant, but then just broke down and admitted it was true. She said they'd been seeing each other for a while now, and in fact, the month before, they had run away together for about a week. But even though they had ultimately come back and they both went back to their respective families, she said that they had still been very much in touch. Christy said that was the reason she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, just to call and just be in touch with him. That was it. But she said when the person answered, and it was a voice that was unfamiliar, it was Detective Lassig, she said that sort of on instinct, she just began to lie and pretended to be Jennifer, Brian's real wife, just so, their affair would not come to light. But Christy made it very clear that she had not heard from Brian since he disappeared, and she had no clue what happened to him. At this point, Lassig sat back on the couch and just looked at Christy, kind of sizing her up. And he thought, she seemed pretty genuinely worried about Brian. And even though the call she had made to the guard shack was ultimately very suspicious and pretty bizarre, her explanation for it did make sense. But at this point, he was certainly not going to rule her out as a suspect quite yet. Also, Lassig knew that Christy's husband, Dale, was also now clearly a primary suspect. Because, if he had found out about this affair, he could have easily hurt Brian in retaliation. The following day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station where Dale was already seated and waiting for him. And the moment Lassig walked in, Dale immediately asked him if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And it seemed to him like Dale's disappointment was genuine, like he was worried about him. Lassig sat down and he asked Dale about how long he'd known Brian for. And Dale said they had met maybe about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they'd become pretty close friends. They'd even hung out together outside of work. At this point, Lassig, almost to catch Dale off guard, he pivoted sort of abruptly and just asked Dale point blank about his wife's affair. And Dale, when he heard that his wife was having an affair, seemed sort of stunned, and he said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. At this point, Lassig just explained to him what his wife had already told him. And Dale appeared genuinely upset. Like, the idea she was cheating on him was horrible, especially with someone he considered clearly to be a close friend. And so as Dale is sort of reacting to this really shocking news, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. And so Dale, who again is sort of like dealing with the shocking news he's just been told, for a moment he just was unable to answer. He ultimately composed himself and he said that actually his car had gotten stuck in the snow while he was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, almost an hour away from the mine. And in fact, he had even had to call a friend to come get him out of the snow. And then he gave Lassig the name of this friend so he could call and confirm it. After taking down this friend's name, Lassig told Dale that he really wanted him to take a polygraph test, and also they would have to search his car. And Dale agreed to both, with no hesitation. One morning, a few weeks later, Lassig walked across a parking lot toward an office building at the Kennecott mine. So far, Brian had still not turned up, and the search for him had been frustrating, because none of the people Lassig had questioned so far had given him any useful information. Dale Bradley, along with his wife, Christy Bradley, had both taken polygraph tests, and both had passed. Lassig had also searched the red Mustang that Dale drove, but there was no evidence in it that linked Dale to Brian's disappearance. Plus, the friend who had helped Dale get his Mustang out of the snow had confirmed he had done that, so his alibi was solid. So at this point, Dale and Christy were sort of unofficially off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the fact that maybe Jennifer, the real Jennifer, so Brian's actual wife, maybe she was involved in her husband's disappearance, despite how, honestly she came across. Now, her coworkers had confirmed she had been at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she could have maybe been working with an accomplice or maybe hired somebody to kill Brian or something. But with no evidence against her and also no body, Brian has not been found here, all Lassig really had here was just a hunch that, maybe she was involved, but who knows. However, just a few days ago, Lassig had received a new lead that sent his investigation in a new direction. That was why he was here right now at the Kennecott mine to speak to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows. So Lassig went inside the building and made his way down the hallway to Todd's office. And when Todd saw the detective, he jumped up and he very eagerly greeted him and said he would do whatever he had to do to try to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told Todd to sit back down. And then Lassig sat down as well, and then he pulled out a tape recorder and he hit record. And then he told Todd why he was there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metal and equipment from the mine and then selling it at pawn shops. In fact, the investigation had discovered that a whole ring of Kennecott employees were involved in these thefts. Todd sort of began to shift in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he was never involved in any of these thefts, and he said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he understood that, and that was not really why he was here. He said when he looked through the records of the investigation about these thefts, he'd found out that Brian had actually been the one who reported some of the thefts that were going on. So now Lassig wondered if maybe on the night of Brian's disappearance, he'd stopped one of his coworkers' vehicles and found stolen materials inside, and maybe they had killed him to keep him quiet. Todd sat back in his chair and looked sort of lost in thought for a moment, and then he admitted that, yeah, that could be possible. He then told Detective Lassig he could actually think of several places on the mine's property where maybe Brian's body was hidden by these, fellow employees if they did this. And then as an example, he suggested the gravel pile by the concentrator, which crushes the minerals and grinds them up. Todd explained that if Brian had been placed there, he would have very likely gotten sucked into the grinders and pulverized with all the other rocks. He'd basically be gone. Detective Lassig was surprised by how specific Todd was being. Todd had really come up with this theory very quickly. So, sensing that Todd might be a little suspicious here, he just let Todd keep going. And Todd did. He just kept spitting out all these theories about maybe what could have happened to Brian, including at one point, he said maybe Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen down and completely covered him up. And he said if that had happened, if Brian had been hidden in a place like that, he would already be buried under several tons of rock at this point, and the police would never find him. On July 10th, 1993, so a year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig drove through a barren desert in Utah about 50 miles south of Kennecott Mine. There had been basically no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours scouring the mine with police dogs and helicopters, looking for any sign that Brian might have been killed or buried or hidden somewhere there. But so far, there was still no trace of Brian. Now, Lassig was confident that there had to have been foul play involved, but it was impossible to prove that when he didn't have a body or evidence that tied any of his suspects to the crime. For months, Lassig's team had looked into every single security guard at the Kennecott mine, especially the ones who had been implicated in that theft ring, but they had ultimately verified that every guard on duty was at their post at the time Brian disappeared. And they'd collected alibis from everyone who was not scheduled to work that night. And so they had not been able to actually link any guards to Brian's disappearance, and that also included Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, who seemed, very eager to offer up these very specific theories. He too was not linked to Brian's disappearance. However, Todd was ultimately linked to that theft ring. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and Christy's husband, Dale, those two, they had alibis, they passed a lie detector test, and really had been ruled out much earlier on in the investigation, and nothing new had come up over the last year to change that, so they were still ruled out. And then as for Brian's wife, Jennifer, Lassig at one point thought maybe she was involved, maybe she had an accomplice or something. She certainly had the motive, to potentially harm her husband. Their marriage was on the rocks, he had clearly been having an affair, and she was on to him. But she really had been at work at the time he disappeared, and there was no link from her to any potential accomplice, and so it went nowhere. She was ruled out too. So again, after more than a year, the case basically had gone cold. However, that particular morning, the investigation had been reinvigorated because a group of campers had called in and said they had found skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew this was obviously a long shot, but he was holding out hope that maybe it was Brian. So when he arrived at the location the campers had described, Lassig got out of his car and he walked a short distance across the barren ground to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer to the crime scene, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow grave. The skeleton was clothed in a dust-covered dark blue jacket, and when Lassig crouched down to get a better look, he saw that it was clearly a security guard's uniform. Lassig put on some gloves and then searched the pockets of this jacket, and his fingers immediately landed on a wallet. And when he pulled it out and he looked inside, he found ID cards and credit cards with the name Brian Ruff. Now, at this point, it seemed fairly apparent that the body had to belong to Brian, but because the body was so decomposed, they would have to examine Brian's dental records to definitively ID him, which would take some time. So, while the crime scene techs carefully loaded the remains into a van, Lassig stayed at the scene with the canine unit that was searching for any other evidence nearby. And sure enough, just a few feet away from where the body had been, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells lying in the dirt. It looked like Brian, very likely, had been shot 5 times and then buried in this shallow grave. Then, just a few yards away from the shells, a police dog began barking, and an officer called Lassig over to look at what the dog had found. He walked over, and the officer held up a black work boot, and there was a pretty obvious bullet hole through the leather. And so Lassig figured the boot must have belonged to Brian. But other than this boot and Brian's actual body, 18 months of heat and, wind and sand and snow and rain out in this desert had basically erased any other traces of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig at this point felt very confident that he knew both where Brian was ultimately killed and how he was killed, because of this severe lack of forensic evidence, he was worried that he might not actually be any closer to figuring out who killed Brian. 12 years later, on April 30th, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office got a call from the Sheriff's Department in the next county over. Since the beginning of the year, Detective Park had been working full-time on solving various cold cases. The detective on the line told him that he was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases, specifically the murder of Brian Ruff. After speaking to this detective, Park hung up the phone and went right over to his filing cabinet and dug through until he found Brian's file. He sat down and began sorting through the decade-old papers, and he realized that there was a tiny piece of evidence the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized it was actually the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Brian Ruff on December 10th, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down a winding service road toward a very isolated part of Kennecott Mine. Up ahead, they saw a single light in the distance. It was coming from a small guard shack right next to a chain-link gate. The killer pulled right up outside of the shack and parked their car and then got out. And then seconds later, Brian Ruff came out of the guard shack and waved hello. And the killer sort of waved back and walked over to Brian, and then as soon as they were close enough, the killer grabbed Brian, whipped him around, tied his hands behind his back, and then forced Brian, before he could do anything, into the back of the vehicle. At this point, the killer jumped into the driver's seat, did a U-turn, and sped out of the mine towards the desert. And as they were driving, the killer heard Brian screaming and kicking in the back, doing everything he could to try to escape. But the killer was unfazed. They stayed calm and just kept on driving for nearly an hour, all while Brian's acting crazy in back, until they eventually reached another very remote spot way out in the desert about 50 miles away. There, they pulled off the road and they stopped their vehicle right in this open, snow-covered patch of desert. They climbed out, they went to the back seat, and they opened the door up, and they grabbed Brian, who was still fighting and trying to escape, but he was pretty tired at this point, and the killer dragged Brian out. And as they dragged Brian out, Brian began pleading for mercy and promised that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone about this. But the killer just grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then forced him at gunpoint to dig his own grave. And then when Brian was done, the killer just raised their shotgun and shot Brian 5 times. And then after he was dead, they dropped his body into the grave he had literally dug himself, and then the killer got back into their vehicle, a red Mustang. But when the killer tried to leave, their vehicle, the Mustang, got stuck in the snow. And so they had to call a friend who did come out, who had no idea a murder has just been committed literally right over there. There's a body buried, right over there. They didn't know. They helped the killer get out of the snow, and off they drove. The killer was Dale Bradley, the co-worker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that he had been an hour away, his car was stuck in the snow on the night Brian disappeared, well, it was true. Except that wasn't an alibi. He was basically describing being at the crime scene and having another friend come and help him flee the crime scene. But the friend who absolutely said, yep, he was an hour away, I helped him get his car out of the snow, the friend had no idea this is where a murder has just taken place. And so they told the truth, and Dale sort of acted like, yep, that's my alibi. And the police never checked. And so they didn't realize that that wasn't an alibi. It was basically a description of where the crime scene was. Additionally, Dale took a polygraph early on in the investigation, and he did pass it. So he really was dismissed as a suspect very early on. And so Dale and Christy had eventually gotten divorced, likely over the affair, and Dale had ultimately remarried. But when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered in 2005, the detective investigating that murder noticed that Dale had been sort of indirectly connected to now 2 people who had been murdered, Crystal and Brian. And he thought it was suspicious enough that he got in touch with Detective Park, the detective who was in charge of all these cold cases, and he told Park, hey, you ought to take a closer look at Dale in the Brian Ruff cold case murder. And so that prompted Detective Park to not just take a closer look at Dale, but really at the whole Brian Ruff case file. And when he did that, he noticed this really small piece of evidence that sort of went overlooked. And that piece of evidence was a tiny speck of red paint on the sole of that black work boot, which had been found near Brian's body out in the desert. And Park was eventually able to match that paint to the same paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was charged with Brian Ruff's murder on September 19th, 2005. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping and was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for Crystal, Dale's second wife who was murdered, her case remains unsolved.